The individual known throughout history as Marie Antoinette first saw the light of day on November 2, 1755, within the Hofburg Palace situated in Vienna. Her parents, Holy Roman Emperor Francis I and Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, bestowed upon her the name Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna. Her arrival was greeted with warmth, though not with excessive celebration, as she was the second to last among 16 offspring, 10 of whom would reach adulthood. It is improbable that anyone could have foreseen that Madame Antoine, the youngest Archduchess of Austria, would ever attain greater notoriety, or that she would, in fact, become one of the most renowned and infamous women in recorded history. Antoine's birth occurred during a period marked by notable diplomatic and geopolitical tensions across Europe. Austria had re-established control over the majority of territories lost or contested during the War of the Austrian Succession a decade prior, with the exception of Silesia, which remained under the dominion of Maria Theresa's perennial adversary, Frederick the Great of Prussia. When Prussia entered into a treaty with England, France's foremost rival in both European and overseas colonial affairs, Austria promptly sought an alliance with France as a potential counterweight, despite the long history of guarded animosity that had characterized relations between the two nations. When Antoine was a mere 6 months old, her parents solidified their nascent alliance with King Louis XIV of France by proposing her betrothal to the king's grandson, Louis-Auguste, Duc de Berry, who was just a year her senior. This marital arrangement, though not formally sanctioned until the children reached the ages of 12 and 13, respectively, would feature prominently in a series of escalating crises that would ignite revolution and warfare. Not only within France, but across the European continent, Antoine was born on what is liturgically recognized as All Souls' Day, or the Day of the Dead, within various Catholic traditions. As this day is traditionally associated with mourning and remembrance of the deceased, the Austrian royal family customarily observed Antoine's birthday in the preceding day, All Saints' Day. Not only was her date of birth considered inauspicious, but on that very same day, a catastrophic earthquake unleashed unimaginable devastation and claimed the lives of 30,000 individuals in Lisbon, Portugal. The King and Queen of Portugal, who had been designated to serve as Antoine's godparents, were compelled to flee their devastated capital. Understandably, these coincidental occurrences were not immediately noted or remarked upon for several years. The communication constraints of the era meant that weeks would elapse before news of the Lisbon disaster reached Vienna, and neither were the Portuguese king and queen actually anticipated to be present for Antoine's christening, as baptisms were invariably conducted within 3 days of birth, and proxies almost invariably stood in for royal godparents. However, in retrospect, during the decades and centuries following Marie Antoinette's death, one might be forgiven for dwelling upon the implied sense of foreboding surrounding her birth, particularly given the ultimately tragic trajectory of her life and the manner of her demise. From her earliest days, a shadow of ill fortune seemed to loom over the young princess. Despite her relatively inconspicuous position within her expansive family, Antoine appears to have experienced a reasonably contented childhood, although her early life is not documented in extensive detail. Her eldest siblings were nearly 2 decades her senior, but 5 of them were sufficiently close in age to serve as both playmates and companions in the schoolroom. While Antoine held affection for all of her siblings, she shared a particularly close bond with her sister Charlotte, who was 3 years her senior. She also enjoyed a robust relationship with her eldest brother Joseph, the future Holy Roman Emperor, despite the considerable age difference between them. Maria Theresa's offspring appeared to regard her with a blend of affection and apprehension. She was deeply devoted to her family, cherished her children, and approached her maternal responsibilities with utmost seriousness. However, as Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary and Bohemia in her own right, she also bore the weighty responsibilities of governing an empire. Maria Theresa's father, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles VI, had enacted a special international treaty in 1713 known as the Pragmatic Sanction, which formally recognized his eldest daughter as his rightful heir in the absence of a male successor. He subsequently orchestrated Maria Theresa's marriage to the former Duke of Lorraine, Francis Stephen. Following the death of Charles VI Sigging, Maria Theresa ascended to the hereditary rule of Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary, while simultaneously ensuring her new husband's election to the position of Holy Roman Emperor, as this title could not be held by a woman. It was the Empress herself, however, who wielded substantive political power and shouldered the preponderance of governmental responsibilities. Maria Theresa's unwavering commitment to duty was such that she reportedly persisted in perusing and signing critical state documents even while confined to her childbed. So averse was she to any perceived wastage of time. Historians have noted that the Empress's vast responsibilities imparted to her a somewhat brusque and austere demeanor, even in her interactions with those closest to her. Despite her demonstrable advocacy for a close-knit family life, she was also perpetually critical of her children, and particularly insistent upon arranging their marriages with the paramount interests of the Austrian Empire firmly in mind. The Latin motto of the Austrian Habsburgs, Bella Gerantalii, tu felix Austria nub, translates to, "Let others wage war, thee, happy Austria, marry." On the eve of Charlotte's wedding to the mentally unstable King of Naples, Empress Maria Theresa penned the following starkly pragmatic sentiment: "So long as she fulfills her duty towards God and her husband and earns her salvation, even if she is unhappy, I will be satisfied." Even Maria Cristina, her mother's most favored child, acknowledged Maria Theresa's more austere qualities. "You know the manner in which she loved her children," she wrote a few years after her mother's passing. "Mixed in with her love, there was always a dose of mistrust and a coldness palpable." As for young Antoine, like the majority of her siblings, her own affection for her mother was perpetually tempered by the Empress's critical pronouncements and her generally low estimation of Antoine's disposition, intellect, and capabilities. The young Archduchess enjoyed a considerably closer and more affectionate relationship with her father. Francis shared relatively little in common with his wife. His pronounced pursuit of personal pleasure stood in marked contrast to her unwavering work ethic, and he appeared to evince greater interest in diversions such as hunting, gambling, and amorous liaisons than in the intricacies of governance. Francis seemed content to occupy his largely ceremonial position, however, and while Maria Theresa indubitably wielded substantive state authority, she relied heavily upon Francis to manage Austria's complex financial affairs. Given the precarious financial circumstances that beset many of Europe's royal treasuries during the mid to late 18th century, Francis acquitted himself rather commendably in these responsibilities. The most unfortunate aspect of Francis and Maria Theresa's marital union was that she almost certainly harbored deeper affections for him than he reciprocated for her. Francis, the erstwhile Duke of Lorraine, had been in essence adopted into the Austrian court at the age of 14, as Emperor Charles VI intended for him to marry his eldest daughter and heir. Maria Theresa was reputed to have been enamored of Francis from their initial acquaintance, feelings that he did not fully reciprocate, although he did appear to hold genuine affection, respect, and fondness for her. He unfortunately demonstrated a compulsive infidelity throughout their marriage, and his persistent and often indiscreet philandering caused his wife considerable sorrow. Nevertheless, as a collective entity, his family appeared to hold him in deep affection. He was characterized as cheerful, vivacious, teasing, and playful when at ease in the company of his children, and he extended to them all, including his youngest daughter Antoine, a level of affection and warmth that their mother often did not readily display. However, both palaces had been constructed and progressively enhanced over time, with a deliberate emphasis on preserving a degree of privacy for the imperial family. In contrast to other mid-18th century European royal families, the Austrian Habsburgs maintained a notable demarcation between the public and private spheres of their lives. The French royal family, conversely, lived much of their lives in the public eye. Even their bathing and dressing rituals might be attended by government ministers and France's most prominent nobles, each of whom firmly believed in their inherent right to such intimate access to the royal family. Austrian royal palaces, in contrast, were designed with more pronounced distinctions between public chambers designated for official receptions and audiences, and private chambers accessible only upon the express invitation of the royal family. Consequently, Antoine and her siblings were raised enjoying a more relaxed, informal family life that differed markedly from that of their contemporary European royal counterparts. Naturally, Maria Theresa and Francis Theresa's children were expected to be present and fulfill their prescribed royal roles in public functions. However, they also regularly enjoyed opportunities for familial recreation removed from the public gaze. The Austrian Habsburgs shared a fondness for outdoor pursuits, such as sledding during the winter months and riding and hunting during the warmer seasons. Vienna stood as one of the most vibrant cultural hubs in Europe, and thus, unsurprisingly, the entire imperial family were ardent devotees and patrons of the arts. Whether in public, for the entertainment of the court, or in private, for their own personal enjoyment, the royal family particularly delighted in music, dance, and staging amateur theatrical productions together. From an early age, Antoine had been exposed to the performances and tutelage of some of the most celebrated musicians, composers, and dancers in Europe. Unsurprisingly, the arts constituted a significant component of Antoine's education, and she demonstrated considerable aptitude across multiple artistic disciplines. She was a particularly accomplished dancer, described by contemporary observers as exceptionally graceful and poised, even as a young child. Antoine also proved to be a proficient musician. She was adept at playing both the harp and the harpsichord, could sight-read musical scores at a professional level by adolescence, and was said to possess a lovely singing voice. However, beyond her notable artistic accomplishments, she was not a particularly diligent student in other academic pursuits. She eventually developed a fondness for history lessons, but remained largely uninterested in all other scholarly subjects. When her newly appointed tutor, Mathieu Jacques, Abbé de Vermont, arrived from France in 1768 to assess her prior education and commence preparations for her impending role as the wife of the Dauphin, he was reportedly shocked and dismayed to discover that the 12-year-old princess could scarcely write proficiently in her own native language. This deficiency is somewhat surprising, given that the Austrian Habsburgs had access to the finest educational resources available in Europe, and several members of Antoine's immediate family were demonstrably well-read and intellectually inclined. Furthermore, Vienna ranked among Europe's foremost cities for intellectual pursuits, sophistication, and a cosmopolitan approach to learning. A substantial proportion of Viennese society and several members of the Habsburg family themselves were trilingual, routinely conversing in German, the vernacular language of their local subjects, Italian reflecting their rule over several regions within Italy, and French as it functioned as the lingua franca of 18th century Europe. At barely 13 years of age, Antoine only spoke her native French with any degree of fluency, although her spoken French was demonstrably influenced by numerous German linguistic elements, and she spoke with a pronounced German accent. A confluence of potential factors may have contributed to her generally underwhelming academic performance. Antoine's father, the emperor, was the former Duke of Lorraine, whose first language was also French. Although he ascended to become Emperor of Austria, albeit in a largely ceremonial capacity, he steadfastly declined to speak or even learn German, a paternal preference that may well have influenced his daughter's linguistic development. Additionally, Antoine's principal governess was described by certain sources as having been somewhat remiss in her duties towards her young charge. Antoine herself consistently displayed an aversion to reading, and it is plausible that she was permitted to neglect those subjects that failed to engage her interest. Furthermore, Antoine's parents may not have deemed her deficient education a matter of sufficient import to warrant rectification. Until it became virtually certain that she would be wed to the Dauphin of France, no one within the Austrian court appeared to place significant emphasis upon Antoine's education or formal training, perhaps because prior to the assurance of her marriage to the future King of France, she was not considered particularly worthy of rigorous instruction for any purpose beyond serving as an attractive adornment to a royal court. Her tutor, Abbé de Vermont, noted that his pupil exhibited a disposition towards indolence and frivolity, hardly surprising in a child whose early education had lacked consistent structure or rigor. He did, however, express confidence in what he perceived to be her innate intelligence. Despite the evident gaps in her formal education, Antoine demonstrated herself to be a quick study. Vermont observed that when sufficiently motivated to learn, she readily grasped new concepts and employed reason admirably to propose solutions to problems. Under his tutelage, Antoine's literacy and learning capacity improved rapidly and dramatically. Though the Austrian Habsburgs appeared to lead lives of unparalleled privilege, even by the standards of European royalty, they were not immune to tragedy. It is, in fact, quite remarkable for 18th century Europe that within a family of 16 children, only 3 did not survive infancy. Another affliction that would repeatedly visit the Austrian royal family was smallpox. 6 members of Antoine's immediate family contracted the disease at various times during the late 1750s and 1760s, including the Empress herself. This prompted Maria Theresa to initiate an inoculation campaign in Vienna, and both Antoine and her younger brother Maximilian underwent the novel procedure, which involved introducing biological material from individuals infected with the virus. This early inoculation method was exponentially more perilous than contemporary vaccination techniques, but fortunately, both children survived and without disfiguring scarring. Three of Antoine's elder siblings, Charles, Maria Johanna, and Maria Josefa, succumbed to the smallpox virus during the 1760s. The family endured another grievous loss with the sudden death of Emperor Francis I in August 1765, attributed to either a stroke or a heart attack. Empress Maria Theresa was utterly devastated, immediately entering into deep mourning. She donned only widow's black attire for the remainder of her days. The loss was equally shattering for 9-year-old Antoine and the rest of the imperial family. Legend recounts that prior to his final departure for Innsbruck, he bid his family farewell but then turned back on impulse to embrace his youngest daughter one last time. Francis I died mere days later in his carriage while returning from the opera. In a codicil to his will, he admonished his children to exercise caution in bestowing their friendship and to refrain from undue haste in placing their trust in others. He further enjoined them to eschew gambling and other dissolute behaviors. In April 1770, a palpably apprehensive 14-year-old Antoine bid farewell to her family, her friends, and her native land. Her mother implored her to conform to the customs of her new husband and his family, and to deploy all of her charm and affability to secure the favor of the French court. "Do so much good to the French people," she wrote, "that they can say that I have sent them an angel." King Louis XIV and her betrothed, the Dauphin Louis, received Antoine's carriage at Compiègne, near the Austrian border with France. Prior to being formally presented to her new family, Antoine underwent a ritualistic change of attire, laden with symbolic significance. Upon an island situated within the Rhine River, the traditional demarcation between Austria and France, Antoine's attendants assisted her in removing all of her garments and jewelry brought from Austria, dressing her instead in French raiment and jewels, notwithstanding that the elaborate court costume she had worn previously was also fashioned in the French style, the preeminent fashion standard throughout Europe. Maria Antonia, Madame Antoine, the Habsburg Princess of Austria, ceased to exist. She was henceforth to be known as Marie Antoinette, Madame la Dauphine, a French princess. Apprehensive and immediately overcome with homesickness, she wept as her Austrian attendants bade her farewell, but endeavored to compose herself sufficiently to be presented to King Louis and her betrothed, the Dauphin. If his bride was beset by nervousness, Louis, just a year her senior at 15, was equally so. Observers noted that his posture remained rigid throughout the service, and that his hands trembled visibly as he placed the wedding ring upon his bride's finger. Regrettably, their apprehension proved to be well-founded. The initial years of their marriage would be characterized by strain and difficulty, factors that would exert a lasting impact upon their respective public reputations. Initially, Marie Antoinette was captivated by the sheer grandeur and magnificence of the French court. Versailles had become the preeminent model for palaces across Europe, endlessly emulated by other European royal families. Indeed, Schönbrunn Palace in Antoine's native Vienna had been constructed very much in the manner of a miniature Versailles, yet the princess remained deeply impressed by the scale and exquisite detailing of the original. She swiftly discerned that fashion, aesthetic refinement, wit, and personal charm were pivotal to securing the admiration of the French aristocracy and royal court, and accordingly resolved to cultivate these attributes, determined to become the most fashionable, captivating, and sought-after woman in all of France. Marie Antoinette initially achieved considerable success at Versailles. King Louis XIV developed an immediate fondness for her warmth, vivacity, and impressive musical talents. Owing to the king's favor, the Dauphine's early experiences at the French court were auspicious, and it may well have been King Louis's positive regard that served to temper certain criticisms directed at the young princess for a time. Despite the admiration elicited by her beauty and youthful vitality, she remained in essence a young teenager, ill-prepared for the demanding role at which she was immediately expected to excel. As many 14-year-olds might have done, she mishandled her interactions with several influential political figures at court, including les tantes, the king's elderly sisters, who considered themselves the ultimate arbiters of etiquette and conduct at the French court. Marie Antoinette was taken aback by the utter absence of privacy that defined life as a member of the French royal family. Having been raised in an environment that maintained a clear distinction between public, political spaces and private spaces reserved exclusively for family members, she was appalled to discover that she was virtually never permitted to be alone or to perform even the most rudimentary personal tasks unassisted. Her resistance to rigid royal protocol and her occasional overt mockery of its elaborate conventions engendered the lasting antipathy of her husband's elderly great-aunts. Additionally, she managed to alienate courtiers from powerful aristocratic families when she relieved them of their household service in favor of younger, more vivacious individuals whom she personally preferred. Marie Antoinette also incurred the lasting enmity of Madame du Barry, the king's officially recognized mistress, whom she steadfastly refused to acknowledge with even a modicum of polite civility during her initial months at Versailles. Moreover, the majority of King Louis's advisors had opposed a marital alliance with Austria for the Dauphin and viewed the young princess with inherent distrust. Those within Versailles circles who harbored apprehensions regarding the potential influence she might wield over the Dauphin in furtherance of Austrian interests pointedly and derisively nicknamed her l'Autrichienne, the Austrian. Regrettably, Marie Antoinette's new husband had been firmly inculcated by his tutors with this same pervasive distrust, encompassing both the Austrian alliance and his new bride, thereby rendering an already challenging marriage between two youthful and inexperienced teenagers even more fraught with complication. The initial failure to consummate the marriage is hardly surprising, given the extreme youth of the bride and groom, who were a mere 14 and 15 years of age, respectively. As matters of a sexual nature were rarely broached, even within familial circles, when the young couple were left alone on their wedding night, they likely possessed little understanding of the expected course of action. They were almost certainly profoundly nervous, having only been introduced to one another mere days prior. Louis recorded in his personal diary that he simply retired to sleep on his wedding night as well as on the two subsequent nights, with Versailles being arguably the least private residence in all of France, particularly for the royal family. The lack of consummation between the Dauphin and Dauphine swiftly became public knowledge. An unconsummated marriage implied that there was as yet no prospect of royal children and legitimate heirs to secure the French throne. As this constituted a matter of considerable state import, courtiers were quick to relay the news to King Louis XV. The elderly king held genuine affection for both his grandson and his granddaughter-in-law, and appeared to exhibit a degree of understanding. He insisted that no one should attempt to pressure the Dauphin on the matter, expressing confidence that the young couple would gradually adapt to their marital state in due course. Empress Maria Theresa, however, displayed considerably less patience with what she perceived to be her daughter's errors and shortcomings. The extensive correspondence exchanged between Maria Theresa and Marie Antoinette during her initial years at Versailles starkly illuminates the fraught and complex relationship between mother and daughter. Kept meticulously informed by her network of spies stationed at Versailles, the Empress consistently criticized Antoine for alienating members of the French court, for her demonstrably extravagant and luxurious lifestyle, and, most emphatically, for failing to effectively cajole or entice her husband into finally consummating their marriage. Maria Theresa upbraided her daughter for allowing herself to become the subject of salacious French tabloid gossip concerning her perceived frivolity and flightiness. She reproached Antoine for neglecting personal improvement, urging her to devote more time to reading, and cautioned her that she lacked the requisite intelligence, talent, social refinement, or strength of character to withstand the even harsher criticisms that the Empress fully anticipated would inevitably ensue. Marie Antoinette frequently responded defensively to these admonitory letters, expressing sorrow and hurt that her mother seemed predisposed to assume the worst concerning her conduct, and assuring Maria Theresa that she did, in fact, prioritize the best interests of both France and the Austrian alliance. As her mother had presciently predicted, it did not require an extended period for Marie Antoinette to cultivate a public reputation for frivolous extravagance. Historians and biographers have subsequently speculated that her ostentatious and increasingly decadent tastes, which she progressively indulged in during the early years of her marriage, particularly following her ascension to the queenship, were in part a compensatory mechanism designed to offset her underlying unhappiness. Not only did she remain physically unfulfilled, but she also experienced profound emotional distance from her husband, who persisted for several years in maintaining a posture of wariness towards his wife, coupled with a deep-seated suspicion regarding her inherent Austrian loyalties. On May 10, 1774, King Louis XV succumbed to smallpox, passing away in his bed at Versailles at the age of 64. He had become deeply unpopular towards the end of his protracted reign, and few beyond his immediate family circle, most notably his grandson, appeared to mourn his passing with any genuine depth of feeling. The French populace now looked towards Louis XVI with a blend of hopeful anticipation and optimism. The new king was youthful, a mere 19 years of age, and while he lacked the charismatic flair or commanding presence of his grandfather Louis XV or his illustrious third great-grandfather Louis XX, he was widely perceived to be a kind, sincere, intelligent, and conscientiously dutiful young man. All qualities that augured well for a potentially just and effective ruler. Queen Marie Antoinette initially enjoyed considerable popularity among the French populace as well. Widely admired for her celebrated beauty, innate sense of style, and captivating personal charm. She expended lavish sums on exquisite garments and opulent jewelry, sporting elaborate wigs that reached heights of up to 3 feet, often adorned with towering confections of netting and extravagant plumes of feathers. She also harbored a pronounced fondness for gambling, frequently incurring exorbitant losses at Paris's fashionable gaming tables. This pattern of behavior earned her the decidedly unflattering epithet of Madame Deficit among the increasingly critical French public, who were becoming ever more convinced that her unrestrained spending habits were contributing as significantly as any other factor to France's burgeoning economic woes. If Marie Antoinette was, in part, compensating for profound loneliness and emotional unfulfillment within her marital union, then Louis was perhaps engaging in similar compensatory behaviors. In the summer of 1777, Antoine's elder brother, Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, undertook a discreet and unofficial visit to France, acting on behalf of their mother to ascertain the overall health of the Franco-Austrian alliance, and, in particular, the deeply troubling state of his sister's marital union. He and Louis reportedly established a cordial rapport, to such an extent that Louis confided in Joseph regarding his intimate sexual difficulties. Historians have long theorized that Louis XV may have suffered from a physical ailment that rendered sexual activity unpleasant or painful, such as phimosis. The hypothesis that the king underwent circumcision to address such a condition has been largely discounted by contemporary historians. Instead, they emphasize letters penned by Joseph II to his mother and brother Leopold, which suggests that Louis's sexual challenges were primarily psychological, likely stemming from a profound sense of inadequacy and embarrassment, stemming from his limited knowledge and experience, coupled with an intense anxiety or apprehension surrounding sexual intimacy itself. Compounding the situation, her husband's reticence within the marriage bed engendered frustration and resentment within Antoine, diminishing her inclination to engage in supportive persuasion. Joseph's visit to France and his subsequent interventions between the king and queen did ultimately yield tangible results. A mere few weeks after his return to Vienna, Marie Antoinette conveyed joyful news to her mother in a letter, announcing that after 7 long years, her marriage had been finally and perfectly consummated. "I do not yet believe myself to be pregnant," she wrote, "but I at least harbor the hopeful expectation of becoming so very soon." The Queen's optimistic assessment proved accurate. The following year, on December 19, 1778, Marie Antoinette brought forth her firstborn child, a daughter christened Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, in honor of her mother and her most beloved sister. The birth of their first child, coupled with the progress they had achieved in their marital relationship, fostered a closer, more trusting bond between the king and queen. And while their initial offspring was not a son, the royal family experienced a surge in public favor for a period. The arrival of a daughter signaled the potential for a dauphin, an heir to the French throne, to follow in due course. A century or more prior, these developments might have sufficed to bolster political stability and mitigate criticism directed at the monarchy, but France during the mid to late 18th century was undergoing dramatic societal, political, and ideological transformations, poised on the precipice of a new era whose values stood in stark opposition to the traditional perceptions and prerogatives of royalty. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had both been nurtured within the rarefied atmosphere of European royalty. Neither possessed any substantive understanding of the lived realities of their subjects, remaining almost entirely insulated from the deep fissures fracturing the bedrock of French society. However, France's rigidly stratified and profoundly unequal social structure was subjected to immense economic strain during the mid to late 18th century, primarily attributable to the escalating costs of protracted warfare. France's numerous conflicts with its European counterparts over the preceding decades, coupled with Louis XII's generous provision of support to the American Revolution, motivated by a desire to weaken Great Britain, had pushed the French treasury perilously close to financial collapse. Concurrently, the French populace endured recurrent episodes of widespread famine owing to a succession of poor harvests. Elevated food prices and persistently high levels of taxation engendered alarming waves of civil unrest, as enraged and desperate citizens struggled merely to secure basic sustenance and shelter for their families. In addition to these severe structural challenges, the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment had begun to thoroughly permeate French society, converting certain members of the aristocracy, a substantial segment of the bourgeoisie, and elements of the working classes alike into adherents of Republican ideals. Inspired by the American Revolution and by the increasingly prominent tenets of governmental accountability, the abolition of noble privilege, and the inherent rights vested in every individual, the philosophical precepts espoused by philosophers and revolutionaries alike posed a direct challenge to the authority and legitimacy of the French monarchy precisely at its moment of greatest vulnerability. Marie Antoinette gave birth to 3 additional children during the 1780s. A dauphin for France in December 1781 christened Louis-Joseph Xavier François, and 2 further offspring, Louis Charles in March 1785, and Marie-Sophie Hélène Beatrice in July 1786. Despite the superficial semblance of enhanced stability and domestic harmony within the royal family, the public reputations of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette continued their downward trajectory. The protracted period during which their marriage remained unconsummated had exacted a heavy toll on public perceptions of both the king and queen. Louis was widely viewed as weak, ineffective, and his perceived sexual inadequacies were metaphorically equated with a broader inability to govern competently. The queen, in turn, was increasingly perceived as domineering, avaricious, and exploitative of her husband's perceived weakness. Within the scurrilous libels or scandal sheets circulating throughout France, Louis XVI was occasionally depicted as a castrated swine, portrayed as dim-wittedly and indolently complacent. Marie Antoinette was frequently lampooned in the tabloids for her reputed luxurious extravagance and alleged political manipulation of her husband in furtherance of Austrian interests. However, exceeding even these criticisms, the public attacks directed against the Queen and the libels tended to be overtly sexual in nature. Traditionally, historians have refrained from definitive pronouncements regarding the precise nature of the relationship between Count Fersen and Marie Antoinette, owing to the fact that the majority of their correspondence has either been lost to posterity, deliberately destroyed, or heavily redacted at a later date. However, in 2016, historians conducting research within French and Swedish archival repositories claimed to have located and definitively deciphered multiple letters that purportedly verify that Fersen and the Queen were indeed intimately involved and deeply enamored of one another for many years. Owing to the prevailing public stain upon her moral character, Marie Antoinette's motherhood did little to rehabilitate her tarnished reputation. Her detractors were quick to insinuate that none of her children, not even the Dauphin himself, were actually fathered by the king. Concurrently, she, her coterie of aristocratic friends, and her children, attired in simple white muslin garments, would recline languidly over elaborate picnics and participate in amateur theatrical performances together, wherein they assumed peasant roles such as milkmaids and shepherdesses. The spectacle of the Queen expending exorbitant sums of money to engage in frivolous play acting as a peasant, while actual commoners at the lower echelons of France's rigid social hierarchy were facing starvation, appeared to many as a stark illustration of cruel indifference and flagrant disregard for all but royal caprice and self-indulgence. Marie Antoinette likely remained oblivious to the public's interpretation of her actions until it was demonstrably too late to rectify their prevailing negative perceptions. Following the birth of her children, Marie Antoinette gradually withdrew from the frenetic social world that had defined her initial years as Dauphine and Queen of France. However, this shift in comportment did little to ameliorate her profoundly negative public image. She began to take a more active and pronounced interest in matters of state, and Louis appeared increasingly receptive to her counsel, particularly in matters pertaining to bureaucratic and military appointments. Her inclination to intercede on behalf of Austrian interests, however, did nothing to endear her to those within the court who had always viewed the Franco-Austrian alliance with deep-seated suspicion. Additionally, she became a far less frequent presence within Parisian ballrooms or at fashionable gaming tables, and had begun to exhibit greater restraint in her sartorial choices, adopting a more frugal approach to her demands upon the royal treasury. However, many of these belated efforts proved to be too little, too late. The period spanning 1787 to 1789 witnessed a confluence of economic and public relations catastrophes that propelled France's monarchy, the oldest in Europe, to the very brink of collapse. The year 1787 proved to be particularly arduous for both Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. Madame Sophie, their infant daughter, succumbed to tuberculosis at a mere 11 months of age. Just a few months later, the Queen, still deeply mourning the loss of her daughter, was approached by the Parisian jewelers Baumer and Bassange, who presented her with an opportunity to acquire a breathtaking diamond necklace, originally commissioned for Louis XV's mistress, Madame de Berry. This extraordinary piece of jewelry featured a staggering 647 diamonds of exceptional clarity and cut, possessing a contemporary estimated value of approximately 7 million euros, or 8 million US dollars. The Queen expressed admiration for the necklace, but promptly declined to purchase it. When a group of thieves concocted a conspiracy to steal the necklace, they deceived a gullible aristocratic cardinal into believing that Marie Antoinette desired him to discreetly purchase the necklace on her behalf, with the understanding that she would reimburse him at a later date. Desperate to ingratiate himself with the Queen, the cardinal eagerly consented to this scheme. When the payment for the necklace became due, the King and Queen were understandably outraged. Two of the thieves had absconded with the necklace, which, of course, they never delivered to Marie Antoinette, and Louis XVI ordered the cardinal's arrest as a co-conspirator. As the cardinal hailed from one of France's most powerful noble families, it is scarcely surprising that the Parlement of Judges, who were themselves overwhelmingly aristocratic, found him not guilty on all counts. Marie Antoinette was utterly devastated. The cardinal's acquittal effectively implied that the theft must have been attributable to the Queen's own During the period spanning 1787 to 1789, the mental and physical health of Louis XVI began to demonstrably deteriorate. He sought refuge from mounting stress through excessive alcohol consumption and overeating, and he lapsed with increasing frequency into debilitating bouts of clinical depression. Of necessity, Marie Antoinette now assumed a more direct and prominent role in French politics, wielding greater authority than she had ever previously exercised. With her husband teetering on the verge of a complete nervous breakdown, she commenced attending King's Council meetings, wherein Louis's chief ministers grappled with the burgeoning economic crisis that threatened to bankrupt France. She was, unfortunately, ill-equipped to effectively assume such a demanding role, possessing limited knowledge of both politics and economics. Nevertheless, her actions during this period attest to a resolute determination to preserve her family and the French monarchy from utter collapse. Having been raised with powerful female role models such as her mother, Marie Antoinette perhaps could not help but believe it her inherent duty to rise to the occasion. She played a pivotal role in both the appointment and dismissal of several successive finance ministers, each of whom proved, for varying reasons, incapable of devising a viable solution to the escalating debt crisis that was slowly crushing the nation. Efforts were undertaken to enlist the financial support of France's nobility, but insufficient numbers proved willing to relinquish their entrenched trade monopolies or tax exemptions to assist in rescuing the imperiled national economy. Finally, in a desperate attempt to avert financial catastrophe, the king convened a meeting of the Estates General, the closest approximation to a parliament or national legislature that France had ever possessed. Louis's summoning of the Estates General was an unprecedented and momentous decision. Representatives of the three legally defined estates of French society, the clergy, the nobility, and the common populace, had not convened since 1614. Owing to the fundamentally divergent objectives pursued by the various participants within the Estates General proceedings, little substantive progress was achieved. The Third Estate, representing the vast majority of the French people, advocated for the establishment of a constitutional French Republic, a concept utterly irreconcilable with the ingrained monarchical principles of both Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, neither of whom could even conceive of sharing sovereign power with elected politicians. The conservative nobility staunchly defended their traditional aristocratic privileges, while numerous other factions vociferously demanded tangible solutions to France's escalating bread crisis, which was causing widespread starvation among both the urban and rural poor. The protracted deliberations ultimately proved futile. A mere month following the formal opening of the Estates General on June 4, 1789, the 7-year-old Dauphin succumbed to tuberculosis. As all of France was preoccupied with the ongoing proceedings of the Estates General, there was scant public discussion or acknowledgement of the royal family's profound personal loss. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were heartbroken. "My poor little boy is deceased," the Queen penned just days later, and the nation scarcely seemed to register it. On the 20th of June, while the King and Queen were still grieving their son, representatives from the Third Estate arrived at Versailles only to find the entrance to their assembly hall locked. Assuming the King had ordered their lockout, they relocated to a nearby tennis court where they collectively proclaimed themselves France's National Assembly and pledged not to dissolve until they had drafted a constitution. The newly established National Assembly promptly began to propose, debate, and enact reforms, growing increasingly concerned by the unchecked progression of these developments. Occurring without royal approval, Marie Antoinette persuaded the king to deploy a contingent of Swiss troops closer to Paris. This action ignited riots within the city, as a fearful populace speculated whether their own government intended to launch an assault against them, and against the changes being implemented by the National Assembly. On the 14th of July, this simmering anger reached a boiling point, culminating in the storming of the ancient fortress known as the Bastille, the liberation of its prisoners, the seizure of its armaments, and the killing of the prison's warden. Paris had erupted into pandemonium and violence. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the king was abruptly awakened at Versailles and informed that the Bastille had fallen. "Is it a revolt?" the king inquired. "No, sire," came the response. "It is a revolution." Following the Bastille's capture, royal authority rapidly disintegrated. A great fear spread among aristocrats across the nation, anticipating further popular uprisings, and many began to discreetly flee France. The majority of the extended royal family and numerous high-ranking courtiers departed Versailles in the ensuing days. Marie Antoinette was also strongly in favor of escape, but when Louis XVI firmly stated his refusal to consider leaving, she resolutely decided to remain at the side of her husband and children. Events began to accelerate in the following months. The National Assembly worked tirelessly to implement their new constitution and reforms, but the increasingly critical food shortage was fueling unrest throughout France. On the 5th of October, rumors circulated in Paris regarding a lavish banquet hosted at Versailles for the senior officers of the King's Swiss Guard. Anger flared amongst the women in the city's marketplaces. Why should there be feasting and abundance at Versailles, while bread remained unaffordable for most Parisians and their children were starving? Armed with knives, pitchforks, cleavers, clubs, and whatever weapons they could find, several hundred women marched towards Versailles to demand bread. Enraged to find her gone, the mob vandalized the Queen's bed. The Marquis de Lafayette arrived just in time at the head of the National Guard to restore order at Versailles. That night, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and their 2 children departed the palace for the final time, never to return. They were escorted by the mob and members of the National Guard to the Tuileries Palace in the center of Paris, where they could be more closely monitored and guarded. The immense pressure now bearing down on the royal family had contrasting effects on Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Louis sank further into depression and indecision, while his wife became more driven to action than ever before. The subsequent 2 years witnessed an extraordinary period of learning and growth for the Queen, who recognized that the responsibility for preserving the monarchy, if at all possible, now rested with her. Since the death of her son a few months prior, she appeared to have matured suddenly, and in the coming months she would engage in the perilous game of double agent. On one hand, she collaborated closely with members of the National Assembly, and later France's legislative and constituent assemblies to influence policy. It was largely due to Marie Antoinette's intervention that Louis XV retained his authority to declare war and veto legislation. Despite viewing France's new political power figures as a pack of madmen, she attempted to work with Republicans such as the Comte de Mirabeau, the Mayor of Paris, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, and the Marquis de Lafayette, whom she despised as much as he loathed her. However, concurrently with her collaboration with the leaders of the revolution, earning their respect for her resolve, courage, intelligence, and dignity, she also stayed up late night after night secretly composing coded letters to monarchist allies throughout Europe, particularly to her family in Austria. She clandestinely kept these contacts informed of developments in France. Her ultimate intentions remain unclear, but she appeared determined to maintain potential escape routes, and perhaps the possibility of one day reclaiming France from the revolutionaries. It is conceivable that Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI might have been capable of adapting to the challenge of a constitutional monarchy. However, they could do little to address the deep divisions emerging among revolutionary leaders and among the French populace in general. No longer satisfied with a constitutional monarchy and the abolition of noble and clerical privilege, many now advocated for the complete removal of both the monarchy and the church. Following the death of Mirabeau, her most significant ally among the revolutionary leaders, Marie Antoinette began to consider escape from France more seriously. The revolution was becoming increasingly radicalized with each passing day. The queen managed to persuade her husband to flee before their freedom of movement was further restricted and escape became unattainable. Late at night on the 14th of June, 1791, the royal family quietly slipped into a carriage outside the Tuileries Palace. In less than an hour, they had departed Paris and were en route to the Austrian border with Count Axel Fersen, who had assisted Marie Antoinette in orchestrating their escape, driving the carriage. Once they were sufficiently far from Paris, Louis instructed the Count to depart, ostensibly because he wished to avoid the appearance of accepting assistance from a foreigner to flee France. However, it is equally plausible that he was eager to send his wife's lover away for his own peace of mind. The royal family reached as far as Varennes, where Louis, who had briefly exited the carriage, was recognized by the local postmaster. Remarkably, the man had only ever seen the king's image on coinage. It is a testament to the poor execution of the escape that Louis was identified. Their carriage, attire, and luggage were excessively luxurious and expensive, and worse, upon searching their belongings, the king's royal regalia and crown were discovered as well. Now truly prisoners, reviled by their own people who believed they would have brought Austrian armies to invade France, the royal family was escorted back to Paris by the National Guard. The crowds lining the route of their carriage were eerily silent, under threat of death from General Lafayette, but watched the king and queen pass with hostile, accusatory gazes. The following year witnessed the revolution become even more radical as the Jacobins ascended to power. Marie Antoinette made a final attempt to work towards promoting a constitutional monarchy, notably by initiating correspondence and policy collaboration with Antoine Bernabe, arguably the most moderate and influential member of the Constituent Assembly at that time. The royal family was relocated to more secure and heavily guarded quarters within the fortress known as the Temple. The family experienced a few months of relative peace together, but in December, the former Louis XVI, now known as Citizen Louis Capet, was placed on trial for treason. He was found guilty and sentenced to execution by guillotine in January 1793. He was granted permission to bid a private farewell to his family before facing his execution the following day, with dignity and quiet courage. The loss of her husband drew Marie Antoinette even closer to her children, but within a few months, her son Louis Charles and her eldest daughter Marie-Thérèse were also taken from her. The Dauphin was perceived as a significant threat, a potential king-in-waiting. His captors subjected the 7-year-old prince to horrific emotional and physical abuse, striving to indoctrinate him with the ideals of the revolution. Marie Antoinette's daughter eventually escaped to Austria, but poor Louis Charles perished in the Temple from tubercular fever at the age of 10. Marie Antoinette was now completely desolate, and on the eve of the announcement of her trial for treason, she was transferred to a bare, squalid, dark cell in the dilapidated fortress known as the Conciergerie. Marie Antoinette's trial was a mockery of justice. She was accused of conspiring with Austria against France, of reckless squandering of the nation's treasury, and of moral and sexual depravity. It is now known that the Queen did indeed regularly provide intelligence to Austria and other European allies. But at the time of her trial, there was absolutely no evidence to support this claim. Lacking any concrete proof, the proceedings devolved into a repetition of all the unfounded rumors that had been disseminated about her in scandal sheets over the years. Her judges even attempted to add an accusation of incest to the list of charges. Louis Charles's jailers had somehow coerced him into accusing his own mother of molesting him. When questioned about her silence regarding this charge, Marie Antoinette responded stoically, "Nature itself refuses to answer such an accusation leveled against a mother. I appeal in this matter to all mothers present in the court." An abashed and shameful silence fell, followed by several women calling out to her in sympathy and support. The judges did not pursue the incest charge further, but nonetheless found Marie Antoinette guilty of treason. When asked if she had any final words, she replied, "I was a queen, and you took away my crown, a wife, and you took away my husband, a mother, and you took away my children. Only my blood remains. Take it if you wish, but do not prolong my suffering." On the morning of the 16th of October, 1793, Marie Antoinette changed from her sole remaining black dress into a plain white one, provided by her jailers. Her hands were bound behind her back, and she was led from her cell in the conciergerie to the courtyard, where a small open cart awaited. As it slowly traversed the streets of Paris, the crowds jeered and hurled obscenities at the still, silent figure in white. She appeared decades older than her 38 years, but maintained her composure, bearing, and expression with dignity. Journalists who witnessed Marie Antoinette's execution later wrote that she carried herself with all the unapologetic arrogance of the most hardened criminal. Yet had she wept, wailed, and pleaded for her life, the same commentators likely would have disparaged her for being a coward. The Queen faced her death with incredible bravery. Upon a platform in the center of the Place de la Révolution, the guillotine stood waiting, surrounded by a throng of people loudly urging Marie Antoinette to her execution. She ascended the few steps without faltering or hesitation and inadvertently stepped on the executioner's foot. Her last words seemed to encapsulate her entire experience from the day she arrived in France to this terrible final moment. "Pardon me, sir," she said quietly. "I did not do it intentionally." Resolutely, she knelt before the block. The blade descended. An eerie silence hung in the air for an instant, followed by a roar as the executioner held up the Queen's head before the baying crowd. For over a century following her death, Marie Antoinette's legacy was one of unrepentant and lavish excess, of utterly insensitive conduct and governance, and disregard for the suffering of others. These accusations are justified to some extent, especially considering the financial burden France bore in supporting the royal family in their customary decadent lifestyle. It is true that as queen, she made numerous mistakes, but in recent decades, an increasing number of historians have begun to rehabilitate her image and argue that she did not deserve her fate. She had been made a scapegoat, and it is a testament to the deep-seated misogyny prevalent in French society that people could believe her supposed greed, sexual voracity, and domination of her husband were solely responsible for the king's weakness, his failure to embrace the revolution, and for France's downfall. As tragic as it was, the execution of Louis XIII possessed a grim logic within the context of the revolution. As long as the king remained alive, plots to restore him to the throne would persist, and the nascent constitutional French Republic would never be secure. Yet it is difficult to perceive the execution of Marie Antoinette as similarly necessary. All authority had been vested in Louis, not his queen. She no longer possessed any power to pose a threat to the revolutionaries holding her captive. Rather than an act of justice, Marie Antoinette's sham trial and execution resemble an act of public vengeance. Far more than the king, she was the most detested figure in France, regardless of any verifiable evidence against her. Very few of the accusations leveled against her in the libels and public rumor mill had any factual basis, not even the most infamous misattributed quote from the Queen, "Let them eat cake," supposedly uttered in response to learning that the French populace lacked bread. Marie Antoinette's execution was a symbolic sacrifice to the revolution. Her blood would serve as expiation to demonstrate that for France, there could be no turning back. What are your thoughts on Marie Antoinette? Was she truly a woman destined for tragedy, caught in historical circumstances beyond her control? Did she squander opportunities to collaborate with reformers and help maintain the revolution's moderate course, or was the downfall of France's monarchy, the radicalization of the revolution, and the advent of the terror all unavoidable? Please share your opinions in the comments section.